The scratching started just after midnight, when the blizzard was at its worst, and Lyra had finally convinced herself she might survive another night alone in her mountain cabin. She'd been stirring a pot of venison stew over the fire, trying to ignore the howling wind that made the wooden walls creak and groan like they might give up and collapse at any moment. 3 years she'd lived in this isolated place. 3 years of solitude and silence, broken only by the sounds of nature and her own voice. When the loneliness got so bad, she had to talk to herself just to remember what human speech sounded like. The scratching came again, more insistent this time, accompanied by a low whine that cut through the storm's fury. Lyra froze with her wooden spoon halfway to her mouth, her heart suddenly pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Nothing came to her cabin. Nothing ever came here. That was the whole point of living so far from civilization, so deep in the wilderness, that even the hardiest trappers avoided this region. She'd chosen isolation deliberately, had walked for 2 weeks into the mountains after her pack cast her out, searching for a place so remote that she'd never accidentally hurt anyone again. The scratching turned to heavy thuds against the door, desperate and rhythmic. Something was out there. Something big. Lyra set down her spoon with trembling hands and moved toward the door, her pale fingers ghosting over the rough wood. She was terrified, but she was also a healer at heart, and that desperate sound pulled at something deep inside her that 3 years of isolation hadn't managed to kill. The bolt slid back with a metallic click that sounded impossibly loud. The door swung inward, and Lyra stumbled back as a wave of snow and freezing wind slammed into her, along with something else. Something massive and white and covered in ice. 12 white wolves poured into her cabin like a flood of winter itself, their enormous bodies filling the small space until Lyra was pressed back against the far wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. They were the largest wolves she'd ever seen, each one easily twice the size of a normal wolf, with thick white fur that seemed to glow even in the dim firelight. Their eyes were various shades of blue and silver, pale and striking, and they were all watching her with an intelligence that made her skin prickle with awareness. These weren't ordinary wolves. These were shifters. The largest wolf, a massive beast with ice-blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul, moved forward slowly. He was at least 4 feet tall at the shoulder, with a thick ruff of fur around his neck and a bearing that screamed alpha even in his animal form. He stopped 3 feet from her and sat, his gaze never leaving hers, waiting. Lyra pressed herself harder against the wall, her mind racing. Looking at these magnificent creatures, seeing the exhaustion in their eyes and the way they trembled from cold despite their thick winter coats, all she could think about was that they were dying. They'd been caught in the blizzard, had somehow made it to her cabin, and if she turned them away, they'd freeze to death within the hour. And she'd already caused enough death for one lifetime. Lyra's own curse had started innocently enough. She'd been 21 when Marcus, a young alpha from her pack, had fallen in love with her despite her strange appearance. She'd been born different. That was clear from the moment she took her first breath. Pure white hair, skin so pale it was almost translucent, eyes the color of ice, and a small frame even for an omega. Marcus hadn't cared about her appearance. He'd loved her wit, her kindness, her skill with healing herbs. When he'd asked her to be his mate, she'd said yes without hesitation. The marking ceremony had been beautiful. Marcus had bitten her neck gently, making the bond that would tie them together for life. They'd celebrated with the pack, made love in their new home, fallen asleep, wrapped in each other's arms. Marcus had been dead by morning. The pack healers said it was a heart attack, sudden and violent, impossible to predict. But Lyra had seen the way people looked at her at his funeral, the whispers that followed her everywhere. The pale Omega and her marked mate, dead before the bond could even settle. Then Cain had insisted on courting her. Cain was a beta, solid and kind, who'd been Marcus's best friend. He told Lyra he didn't believe in curses, that Marcus's death was just bad luck, and she deserved a second chance at happiness. She'd resisted for 6 months, terrified of losing someone else, but Cain had been persistent and gentle, and eventually she'd given in. Cain had been dead by dawn. Heart attack, the healers said again, 2 days after marking Lyra. That's when the pack had turned on her completely. The pale widow, they'd called her, Death's bride, cursed by the moon goddess to kill any male who tried to claim her. The Alpha had given her a choice: leave voluntarily or be executed as a threat to the pack. Now these 12 wolves were in her cabin, their eyes on her, their lives in her hands. The decision made itself. Lyra took a shaking breath and moved slowly away from the wall, keeping her movements careful and non-threatening. She spent the next hour checking each wolf for injuries, her gentle hands running through thick white fur, looking for wounds or signs of frostbite. She cleaned wounds with warm water and her precious store of antiseptic herbs, applied salves that would fight infection and speed healing, used strips of cloth to bind the worst gashes. She built up the fire until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm, knowing the wolves needed heat to recover. She fed them her entire pot of stew and most of her dried meat. Through it all, the big Alpha never left her side. He followed her from wolf to wolf, watching her work with those intense blue eyes. And whenever she moved back toward the fire, he was right there, his massive body, a warm presence just behind her. By the time she'd finished treating everyone, Lyra was exhausted, and the blizzard outside had intensified to the point where she couldn't see more than a foot beyond the windows. They'd be trapped here for days at least, maybe a week if the storm kept up. She looked at the 12 enormous wolves now sprawled around her small cabin and felt a laugh bubble up in her throat. 3 years of isolation, and now her cabin was full of the biggest wolves she'd ever seen, all of them watching her with disturbingly intelligent eyes. The Alpha made a sound that was almost a chuckle, a huffing noise that made his whole body shake. Then he moved to the rug in front of the fire and laid down, his massive head resting on his paws. The others followed his lead, arranging themselves around the room in a loose pack formation. Lyra was too tired to analyze it. She banked the fire, wrapped herself in her warmest blanket, and climbed into her small bed in the corner of the cabin. The big Alpha immediately rose and padded over, settling himself on the floor right next to her bed, his massive body a warm barrier between her and the rest of the pack. Lyra reached down without thinking and buried her fingers in his thick fur. The wolf made a rumbling sound of contentment and pressed closer to her touch. Lyra fell asleep, with her hands still tangled in white fur, feeling safer than she had in 3 years. Days passed in a strange domestic rhythm. Lyra checked their wounds and was pleased to see them healing faster than normal, which confirmed they were shifters. She talked to them as she worked, her voice filling the silence she'd kept for 3 years. The wolves listened with remarkable attention. They brought her firewood from the covered pile outside, taking turns braving the brutal storm. The Alpha stayed by her side constantly, his presence both protective and oddly comforting. By the 3rd day, Lyra had started naming them in her head. The Alpha she called Frost, both for his colouring and the icy intensity of his gaze. On the 4th morning, Lyra woke to silence. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world buried in white. Brilliant sunshine streamed through the windows, making the snow outside sparkle like diamonds. She sat up in bed and found the cabin empty, except for Frost, who was sitting exactly where he'd been when she fell asleep, watching her with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. Her heart clenched. They were already gone. All of them except the alpha. She heard movement behind her and turned to find Frost had risen and was padding toward the door. But he didn't scratch at the door to be let out. Instead, he sat down facing it and made a low, chuffing sound. Almost immediately, the door swung open and 12 men walked in, all of them completely naked and absolutely stunning. The man in front was the most beautiful man she'd ever seen. Platinum blonde hair fell to his shoulders in thick waves. His face was all sharp angles and strong lines with a jaw that looked carved from marble. His body was pure muscle, broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist and long legs. And his eyes, those ice blue eyes, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees weak. He spoke, his voice deep and rich. "My name is Theron, Alpha King of the Northern Crown Pack. These are my elite guard. You saved our lives when you could have left us to freeze. You fed us when you barely had enough for yourself. You healed our wounds and kept us warm and asked for nothing in return. By the laws of the moon goddess and the rights of my position, I claim you as my intended mate and ask for your hand in joining with me to rule my pack as my Luna and Queen." Lyra stared at him, her mind refusing to process what she was hearing. "I can't," she whispered, her voice cracking on the words. "You don't understand. I can't be anyone's mate. I can't mark or be marked. I'll kill you." Theron rose to his feet in one smooth motion. "I know about your curse. I know about Marcus and Cain. I know what your pack called you and why you ran. And I know the truth that they didn't." Lyra's legs gave out, and she sat down hard on her bed, staring up at him with wide eyes. "What truth?" Theron knelt in front of her, bringing himself down to her level, his ice blue eyes locked on hers. "You're not cursed, Lyra. You're blessed. You're a true mate, Omega, one of the rarest gifts the moon goddess can give. You can't be marked by just anyone. Your body rejects bonds that aren't meant to be, protecting you from false matings. Marcus and Cain died because they tried to force a connection that was never supposed to exist. Their hearts couldn't handle the rejection of the mate bond when your soul recognized they weren't your true match." One of the other men stepped forward. "I'm Sterling, the pack's head healer. True mate Omegas are so rare that most healers never see one in their entire lives. The signs are subtle. A mate bond rejection leaves no physical damage at all. The heart simply stops because the soul can't bear the wrongness of the bond." Lyra looked between them, wanting desperately to believe, but terrified of the hope blooming in her chest. "How do you know I'm this true mate, Omega? How can you be sure?" Theron reached out slowly and took her hands in his. "Because I've been searching for you for 2 years. My mother was a seer. Before she died, she told me about the pale Omega who lived alone in the mountains, cursed by her pack, but blessed by the moon goddess. She said I'd know you by your appearance and your gift. Hair like moonlight, skin like snow, eyes like ice, and hands that heal what others can't. She said you'd save me when I was at my weakest, and that you'd be the only one who could complete my soul. We weren't caught in that blizzard by accident, Lyra. We were on our way to find you when the storm hit. The moon goddess herself led us to your door. But what if you're wrong?" Lyra whispered. "What if I mark you and you die too? I can't do that again." Theron released one of her hands to cup her face. Then don't mark me yet. Let me court you. Let me prove I'm your true mate. We'll take as long as you need, weeks, months, years if necessary. I'll wait forever if that's what it takes for you to trust me. To trust this. The next weeks passed in a strange sort of domesticity that Lyra had never experienced before. Theron and his elite guard stayed at her cabin, working to dig out from the blizzard. They hunted fresh meat to replenish her stores. They repaired the damage the storm had caused. And Theron courted her with a patience and gentleness that made her heart ache. He told her about his life as Alpha King, about the pressure to find a Luna, about meeting Omega after Omega who wanted the title but didn't want him. In return, Lyra told him about her life, about her grandmother raising her with fierce love despite the Pack's suspicion, about Marcus and Cain and the devastating guilt that had driven her into isolation. Theron listened to everything without judgment. He never pushed her to talk about painful subjects, but he was always ready to listen when she needed to speak. The elite guard treated her like she was already their Luna. They brought her small gifts from their hunting trips. They were establishing pack bonds with her, making her feel like she belonged. And it was working. Lyra found herself falling in love with all of them as pack, but it was Theron who owned her heart. She fell in love with him slowly, piece by piece, moment by moment. The way he looked at her like she was precious, like her pale appearance wasn't a curse, but a gift. 2 weeks after the blizzard, Lyra woke to find her cabin empty again. Panic seized her heart until she saw the note on the table in Theron's precise handwriting. "Good morning, love. We've returned to camp to check on things and gather proper supplies. We'll be back by evening. You're not alone anymore. I promise." Lyra clutched the note to her chest and cried. They returned at sunset as promised, carrying packs full of supplies. That night, Theron asked if he could sleep in her bed instead of on the floor in wolf form. "Just sleep," he promised. "I won't push for anything you're not ready for. But I want to hold you. Will you let me?" Lyra knew it was dangerous, knew she was getting too attached, but she was tired of being scared. "Yes," she whispered. He climbed into her small bed, pulling her against his chest and wrapping his arms around her. "I love you," he murmured into the darkness. "I've loved you since that first night when you let us into your home despite your fear. When you healed our wounds with gentle hands. I love your strength and your kindness and your resilience. I love everything about you, Lyra, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of you." Lyra's breath hitched. She wanted to say it back, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she pressed closer and held him tighter. They left for the Northern Crown Pack 3 days later. The journey took 5 days through mountain passes and deep forests. Theron stayed human, walking beside Lyra and pointing out landmarks, holding her hand the entire way. The Northern Crown Pack's territory was stunning. They lived in a valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks, with a huge lodge built from timber and stone. Wolves in both human and animal forms moved through the settlement, all of them stopping to stare as their Alpha King returned with a stranger. Lyra wanted to run, wanted to hide, but Theron pulled her closer. "Northern Crown Pack," he called out, his voice carrying through the entire lodge. "This is Lyra, the pale Omega of prophecy. She saved my life and the lives of my elite guard during the blizzard. She's been chosen by the moon goddess to be my Luna and your queen. Anyone who disrespects her disrespects me." An elderly woman with silver hair stepped forward. "About time you found her boy. Your mother told me about the pale Omega 20 years ago. Welcome home, child. We've been waiting for you." The old woman's acceptance seemed to break the tension. Other pack members came forward, introducing themselves, welcoming her. The next few weeks were an adjustment. Lyra had to learn pack hierarchy, pack customs, pack politics. It was overwhelming and exhausting, and sometimes she wanted to run back to her cabin. But Theron was there for every moment, and slowly, the pack began to accept her. They saw how she healed their children's scrapes with gentle hands. They saw how she treated everyone with kindness, regardless of their rank. They saw how their alpha king looked at her like she hung the moon. 3 months after arriving at the Northern Crown Pack, Lyra finally felt like she belonged. She ran the healing lodge with Sterling, training young healers. She advised Theron on Omega-related issues. She was becoming a true Luna, even without being officially marked. But the fear still lived inside her. Every time Theron looked at her with heat in his eyes, she felt the terror rise up. What if she was wrong? What if he wasn't her true mate? It was the elderly woman named Sage who finally made her see reason. "Child," the old woman said one evening, "you're letting fear control your life again. You ran to the mountains because you were afraid. Now you're refusing to complete your bond because you're afraid of the same thing. But fear isn't living. Fear is just another kind of death. That boy loves you more than his own life. Are you really going to make that choice for him?" Lyra thought about it for 3 days. She watched Theron lead his pack with strength and wisdom. She remembered how he'd courted her with gentleness and respect. He was nothing like Marcus or Cain. They'd been good men, but they'd been wrong for her. Theron didn't see a curse to overcome. He saw a blessing to honor. He was her true mate. She knew it, in her bones, in her soul. On the night of the full moon, Lyra went to Theron in their chambers, wearing nothing but a silk robe. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready to complete the bond. I'm ready to stop being afraid and start living." Theron crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling her into his arms. "Are you sure? We can wait longer if you need to." "I'm sure," Lyra said firmly. "I love you, Theron. I want to be yours completely. I'm not afraid anymore." They made love slowly, thoroughly, with a tenderness that made Lyra cry. When the moment came to mark her, Theron paused, his teeth against her neck, giving her one last chance to stop this. But Lyra tilted her head to give him better access and whispered, "I trust you. I trust us. Mark me." His teeth sank into her neck, and Lyra felt the bond snap into place. It was nothing like what she'd experienced before. This was 2 souls recognizing each other, welcoming each other, completing each other. It was warm and right and perfect. And Theron didn't die. They lay together afterward, Lyra's head on his chest, listening to his strong, steady heartbeat. He was alive. He was healthy. He was hers, and she was his, and the curse was finally truly broken. "I told you," Theron murmured. "The moon goddess doesn't make mistakes. You were always meant to be mine, and I was always meant to be yours. Nothing could change that. Not curses, not fear, not 3 years of isolation." Lyra kissed his chest right over his heart. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for being patient. Thank you for loving me even when I couldn't love myself." "Always," Theron promised, "for the rest of our lives and whatever comes after. You're mine, Lyra, my mate, my Luna, my queen, my everything." The marking ceremony was held under the full moon 3 days later. The entire Northern Crown Pack gathered to witness their Alpha King officially claim his Luna. Lyra wore a dress made of white fur and silk that seemed to glow in the moonlight, her platinum hair adorned with winter flowers. When Theron marked her again in front of witnesses, the pack howled in celebration. The sound echoed through the valley, through the mountains. a song of joy and belonging and new beginnings that Lyra felt in her very soul. Years later, when young Omegas came to Lunar Lyra feeling cursed or different or unwanted, she'd smile and tell them her story. About living alone for 3 years in a mountain cabin, about 12 white wolves scratching at her door during a blizzard, about choosing to help them despite her fear, about falling in love with an alpha king who saw her blessing instead of her curse. I thought I was cursed, she'd tell them. I thought my appearance and my gift made me dangerous. But the moon goddess had different plans. She marked me pale so my true mate would recognize me. She gave me healing gifts so I could save his life. Everything I thought was a curse was actually a blessing I hadn't learned to see yet. Sometimes the right person doesn't come when you're ready for them. Sometimes they come when you need them most, when you've given up. That's when the moon goddess shows you that you were never cursed. You were just waiting for someone brave enough to see your blessing.